coming at this special time. And of course, we are joining both of you to our Global Dialogue series to talk about the past, present, and the future of the BRICS, and also the future globalization development. So this is really a right time to talk about this. And actually, I know that Lord Jim O Neill actually just published a paper on the BRICS at Financial Times 2 days ago. So it's really great to have you. But I'd like to first quickly introduce our distinguished guest today. Lord Jim O Neill is a renowned economist and the creator of BRICS acronym, and which later become BRICS. As we know, the BRICS stands for Brazil, Russian, India, China, and South Africa. But also, Jim has actually, until very recently, he was the former chairman of the Royal Institute of International Affairs in London, which we know that as a Chatham House. And he was also previously a former commercial secretary to Her Majesty, Treasurer of the UK in the government of David Cameron. And of course, and many years, he was the chief economist at Goldman Sachs. And recently, he became a member of the Pan-European Commission on Healthy and Sustainable Development. So you have many, many very important titles, and you have a huge impact. You know, here in Chinese, you've been referred as the father of the BRICS concept. So your name is no stranger here. So a lot of people knows that. And also, I'm very glad to have another friend of mine, and Mr. Leslie Mastrop, and he actually is leading the New Development Bank, and is the vice president and the CFO of this BRICS 4 countries New Development Bank, and he actually held numerous important positions in both the government of South Africa and also private sector, but also including the managing director and president of Bank of America Merrill Lynch in South Africa. So in 2002, he was also the first African to be appointed as international advisor to Goldman Sachs International, where he and Jim, of course, where you and Jim worked together. So, you know, this is a very fascinating time. I just want to opening up on this. And this year marks the 20th anniversary of coining the BRICS concept by you, Lord Jim O Neill. And BRICS also has evolved into an international global player, actually. You know, we had also 15 years anniversary of the BRICS summit and cooperation. And also now the concept of BRICS has been, widely accepted and also recognized around the world. And also there's new countries like Indonesia, like South Korea, and many others actually are doing quite well. So perhaps, Jim, I can start with you. Maybe you can say something to our audience, which we carry live, both in China and outside China. And so I know you just published an article in the Financial Times, which is really a great article. We just saw that. I have a piece of your article there, and you talked about many interesting concepts. You give the review of the birth of the BRICS, but also you mentioned about your vision at that time. You want to expand BRICS role, and maybe at IMF and the World Bank and even G7, you were thinking of expanding that. So what's your assessment? Maybe you can give us some opening remarks on that. Thank you, Jim.
Well, thank you very much, Henry. I hope you can hear me clearly. Yes, through my audio from London today. It's a huge privilege to join you to speak at such a prestigious series, and especially with my good friend Leslie. It's a great honor to be part of this discussion. I could probably spend the whole hour just answering this first question. So let me try to be very selective and as brief as I can. As you mentioned, I had an article published in the Financial Times 2 days ago, and because it is the 20th anniversary, actually a number of global media organizations are actually covering their own interpretation of the 20th anniversary throughout the week. I just think I heard this morning the very well regarded Nature magazine actually has got its own feature on the topic, which did include an interview with me too. And during the whole week, Bloomberg television and their journalists have also been running a number of different pieces. So perhaps I'll just try to select 3 opening comments, some of which I'm sure we will pursue in further parts of our discussion. In contrast to the headline that the Financial Times chose, it's important, as each of you know, that when you write an article for a newspaper, you never have any control over the title or headline. You only have control over the content. And the FT chose to have a headline that the BRICS have been a disappointment, which I think is has some truth on some levels, particularly at the policy coordination level. But of course, by definition, any group that involves China over the past 20 years, that is obviously very far from the truth. Because when I reflect on the economic developments of 20 years ago, and compare it to what our famous projections showed, China has surpassed considerably more any of the scenarios that I and my team assumed in the early days of the BRICS idea. And in many ways, and I'm sure is often a feature of many of your discussions with fascinating people, one of the most remarkable things of the economic history of my lifetime and before is the performance of China the past 30 years, 20 years of which has been a BRIC. It's also true that by and large, India has essentially achieved the broad growth path that we outlined. And that's why today China and India are so much bigger parts of the world economy than they were 20 years ago. It is the case, unfortunately, that the other two in the original acronym of mine, Brazil and Russia, after having a very good first decade where they surpassed also all expectations of ours, have actually had an equally very poor second decade. And ironically, each of those countries' share of global GDP is almost back to where it was 20 years ago. And in that sense, the objective reality is when it comes to their economic performance, they've been a disappointment. And I would add, unfortunately, the same is, of course, true for South Africa also. And whilst there are many, many differences between them, I think at the core dilemma, which relates to policy issues I'll come on to, each of those 3 show signs of the much discussed commodities curse, which can often be a problem for many emerging economies that are trying to break through the middle income trap. And this is a challenge that each of those 3 countries faces in the future, in my opinion, even though there are many differences between them. Second thing to say, as you touched on, Henry, especially in the very first paper of 20 years ago, my whole point of creating the acronym deliberately is a play on the English word BRICS, as in building bricks, is that it seemed already 20 years ago that global governance wasn't adequately represented by big emerging economies. And that was the basis of my paper, especially coming 2 years after the creation of the euro and the introduction of a single currency for every big continental European country, it seemed to me very clear that there was no great case for single representation of each of Italy, Germany, and France in global economic governance. And so the G7 could be both consolidated and expanded to include important emerging economies. And whilst that never happened, of course, 7 years later in 2008, prompted by the global financial crisis, we had the advent of the G20, which at its core was in reality to bring in these big emerging economies into the center of global economic governance. And at the time, if we would have had this discussion in 2008 or even 2010, I would have been very excited about what this meant for more representative and more equitable global governance. And of course, importantly with it, as I mentioned in the FT story, we also had the introduction of the Financial Stability Forum, which became the Financial Stability Board. And in 2010, we had the first significant reform in the voting shares and structure of the IMF and the World Bank. And with it, the change in the basket of the SDR to include the Chinese RMB. Unfortunately, and hence why the FT picked on this title, in the decade since, and unfortunately so strongly exhibited during this crisis there has not been any further significant improvements in global governance at all. And the contrast between the G20 meeting of 2020 and 2021 and those of 2008 through 2010, in my opinion, is very disappointing and something that needs to be urgently changed for the future of all 7 billion people around the world. And then the third thing, very quickly, on the BRICS political group itself, I think, as I know, because I talk to Leslie about this quite often, on a sort of unnoticed level, there are very important positive developments that have taken place with a whole series of ongoing discussions between BRICS ministers, whether they be economic or health or political, that take place all the while. And by definition, that is a great development, as of course was the development or the introduction of the new development bank that Leslie represents. But it is the case, in my opinion, and one has to be careful to be diplomatic, and I don't want to offend anybody, but it is the case that the actual cooperation between the BRICS political leaders on an economic basis has not really demonstrated any evidence that it's materially helped any of their economies. And I finish for now with the rather sober reflection that if you look at the collective economic performance before and since the BRICS political group was established, it has weakened. Now that may have nothing to do with the introduction of the BRICS political group, but it certainly raises the possibility, as I've touched on, that they haven't so far done anything to ensure stronger economic performance between them. But I apologize for already talking quite long, but I said, I could have talked for the whole hour, and I'm sure we'll come back to some of these topics.
No, thank you, Jim. I think, as the creator of this BRICS concept, actually led to the BRICS country groups and also summits and all those things. I mean, the origin is from you. I mean, you are very visionary in terms of proposing this very practical idea, and then you are a champion for the BRICS countries. I think, even though I think FT has actually used the title as little sensational, but actually the BRICS countries still, I mean, as an emerging power, is still particularly China, is doing still relatively well. But maybe just follow up on your this opening remarks. I just wondering that you envision at that time that the global governance system maybe can bring in more BRICS countries to participate. We shouldn't be a Western country dominated system. You recommended that BRICS countries should be have more share in the international mechanism like like MIF, World Bank, I mean, and institutions like that. So, and of course, G20, but actually, we see some ideological and political divide on the G20. But also, you mentioned about G7. Can that be expanded to G10, maybe including a few BRICS countries? Those are really very, very good ideas, I think. So, what do you see the BRICS countries in the global governance system now? I mean, we have to really work together as a multilateralism. I think just not too long ago, we had this global, BRICS summit, and President Xi actually mentioned about how we can continue to support multilateralism. And so what do you see the BRICS countries' role in the future in the global governance? Any new ideas or recommendations?
I can't. Again, three very quick, but in this case, definitely much briefer responses. The first one is I can't resist repeating a joke that I've said for much of the past 15 years and discussed with Leslie and his colleagues at the New Development Bank. Given how the political group and the New Development Bank came about because of my acronym, I'm still waiting to be made honorary president of the Development Bank. The second thing to say, slightly more seriously, is it is remarkable when I look back 20 years ago as to what was in my head and what I thought would be much more optimal for the world. How many of those thoughts are still in my head now, even though the world has changed so much? If I just answer this part of the second thing with two subparts very quickly. With the existence of the euro and a shared monetary and fiscal policy in Germany, France, and Italy, I don't really understand the logic as to why each of the three of them, all of which have very poor domestic economic growth performance, warrant a seat separately at some kind of global table of economic policy affairs. It is completely lacking in any rationale other than economic history, and perhaps, of course, the fact they all come from the same continent and have the same shared democratic values. And then the second part of answering that, I often think this is perhaps why we have some of the difficulties that we have in the world, because as great as the G20 development was, as anybody that participates in these G20 meetings will always say to me, it's too many countries and too many people to be a especially useful framework for making tough decisions. I'm a big believer in deliberately recognizing the difference between compromise and conciliation. And the more people that are in a decision-making group who are bored, by definition, the more people default to compromise, usually the weakest compromise, instead of deliberately trying to conciliate. And I think a reformed smaller group inside the G20, which would still be along the lines of what I said 20 years ago, would make a huge amount of sense. And then the last part of answering you on this for now is I think it would help if the BRICS leaders themselves had a stronger shared collective priority more frequently on some key issues. You will know, Henry, yourself, and Leslie will also, that there has been occasions where there was a small window for important global leadership positions, such as the IMF or the World Bank, to come from a big emerging country. I'm thinking of particularly about 5-6 years ago when the positions were up, and there did seem to be a chance that we could break the mold of one coming from Europe and one coming from the US. But one of the reasons why that never happened is because the BRICS countries themselves didn't be strong enough to share who that person should be from the emerging world. And the third thing to say, and because you touched on it in your intro, again, I know because of my deep involvement in global health, in the past 2 months, some of the BRICS countries have been very opposed to the idea of the introduction of a global health board under the G20, despite it clearly being in their own very, very strong interests. And I think it partly reflects the difficulties that the BRICS leaders have themselves on sometimes coming to a common position, not just for themselves, but to contribute for the greater interest for the world.
Yeah. Thanks, Jim. I think for those very stimulating ideas that you have been proposed in the past, but I've continued to think in that way. I agree with you. I think that maybe G20 is a bit too many, but I also noticed that the chairman of the Council of Foreign Relations, Richard, has actually proposed G6, EU and the US, China, India, and Japan, and all the big countries. So
that idea. Sorry, Henry. That idea would be very similar to the one that I suggested and still believe.
That's right. I think you're right. So your idea is actually to bring China, India, and other emerging market a bit more into this global governance system.
Yes,
that'd be really would be very, very helpful. And I agree with that. If this old global governance system, including health system, is dominated by West countries, and then maybe sometimes getting politicalized, those BRICS countries probably reluctant to play part. But I think we need to create a climate gradually to improve that. I agree with you. So Leslie, I mean, you are the BRICS man, basically. One of the products, as I agree, I think Jim should be the honorary chair of this new development bank. But you are the man also running the think tank, and you coming from BRICS countries. So what do you think about this? One of the achievement of BRICS countries, that by setting up this new development bank, and also in our head office in Shanghai, you are having a new office, brand new, to move in soon. I understand. Also now, from last several years, new development bank has already land, $24 billion, dollars and things like that. So probably you can give us your perspective about BRICS and new development bank.